Private Desmond Doss saved 75 men at Hacksaw Ridge. He never fired a weapon. He was a combat medic who refused to carry a gun, a conscientious objector who believed killing was wrong under any circumstance. His fellow soldiers called him a coward. His commanding officers tried to have him discharged. But on May 5, 1945, during one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific, Desmond Doss did something no one thought possible. He climbed back up that cliff alone, over and over, pulling wounded men to safety, while Japanese soldiers fired on him from every direction. This is the story of what happened when one man's faith collided with America's most brutal war. Desmond Doss grew up in Lynchburg, Virginia, the son of a carpenter and a devout Seventh-day Adventist mother. The Seventh-day Adventist faith taught strict adherence to the Ten Commandments, particularly, "Thou shalt not kill." For Desmond, this wasn't just a religious principle. It was the foundation of who he was. In 1942, when America entered World War II, Desmond was 23 years old. He worked at a shipyard in Newport News, which qualified him for a deferment. He could have stayed home, safe, contributing to the war effort without ever seeing combat. He volunteered anyway. Desmond believed in serving his country. He believed in protecting freedom. But he also believed, without compromise, that he could not kill another human being. So when he registered for the draft, he checked the box marked conscientious objector and wrote one clarification. He would serve as a combat medic. The army didn't know what to do with him. Conscientious objectors typically served in non-combat roles, far from the front lines. They drove ambulances, worked in hospitals, performed administrative duties. But Desmond wanted to serve with a combat infantry unit. He wanted to be where the fighting was most intense, because that's where medics were needed most. In April 1944, Desmond reported to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, for basic training with the 77th Infantry Division. His nightmare began immediately. The men of Company B didn't understand Desmond Doss. Here was a soldier who refused to carry a rifle, refused to train on Saturdays because of his Sabbath observance, and spent his evenings reading the Bible while they played cards and drank. They called him a coward. They called him a fraud. Some openly said he was getting men killed by refusing to carry a weapon. His squad mates made his life miserable. They threw boots at him while he prayed. They cursed him, mocked him, questioned his manhood. One soldier later admitted they tried to force him to quit, to make training so unbearable that Desmond would simply give up and go home. Desmond's commanding officers weren't much better. Captain Jack Glover, his company commander, believed that a soldier who wouldn't carry a rifle was a liability. He tried everything within regulations to get Desmond transferred or discharged. Glover assigned him extra duties, denied him leave, and repeatedly recommended that Desmond be declared unfit for combat service. The situation escalated when Desmond refused to train on Saturdays. According to Army regulations, religious observance was supposed to be honored when possible, but in combat training there were no days off. When Desmond refused a direct order to train on the Sabbath, Captain Glover had him arrested for insubordination. Desmond spent several weeks in the stockade. Military lawyers recommended a court-martial. The case went all the way to the regimental level, where it caught the attention of Colonel Stephen Hamilton, the 77th Division's commanding officer. Hamilton reviewed Desmond's file. He saw a young man who consistently volunteered for the hardest duties, who never complained, who worked twice as hard as anyone else to prove himself. Hamilton made a decision that would change history. He ordered Desmond released and ruled that his Sabbath observance would be honored. But the ruling came with a condition. Desmond would deploy with his unit. He would serve as a combat medic, and if he couldn't prove himself in battle, he would be transferred to a non-combat role. In March 1945, the 77th Infantry Division shipped out to the Pacific Theater. They were heading to Okinawa. To understand what Desmond faced at Hacksaw Ridge, you need to understand Pacific warfare in 1945. This wasn't the war Americans were fighting in Europe. The rules were different. The brutality was different. Japanese military doctrine prohibited surrender. The code of Bushido taught that capture was the ultimate dishonor, worse than death. Japanese soldiers fought to the last man, and when defeat became inevitable, they often killed themselves rather than be taken prisoner. This created a unique horror for American forces. There were no safe prisoners to guard, no enemy units that simply gave up when surrounded. Every fortified position had to be taken by force. Every cave had to be cleared with flamethrowers and grenades. Every bunker fought until it was destroyed. The casualty rates reflected this reality. At Tarawa, the Marines suffered 3,000 casualties, taking an island just 2 miles long. At Peleliu, 32% of the 1st Marine Division became casualties. At Iwo Jima, which took place 2 months before Okinawa, 70,000 Marines landed to face 21,000 Japanese defenders. 27,000 Americans became casualties. Nearly 7,000 died. The Japanese fought until almost every defender was dead. Only 216 surrendered out of 21,000. Okinawa would be worse. April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. The 77th Infantry Division landed on Okinawa as part of the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. 183,000 American troops came ashore, facing a Japanese defense force of 77,000 soldiers and 20,000 Okinawan conscripts. The initial landings went smoothly. Japanese forces had withdrawn from the beaches, preferring to fight from prepared defensive positions inland. The Americans moved forward cautiously, expecting ambush at any moment. The real battle began when American forces reached the Shuri Line, a defensive network of fortifications, caves, and bunkers that cut across the southern part of the island. Japanese commander Lieutenant General Mutsuru Ushijima had spent months preparing these positions. His strategy was simple: make the Americans pay in blood for every yard of ground. The 77th Infantry Division received orders to assault a position the Americans called Hacksaw Ridge. The Japanese called it Uraisomura Escarpment. It was a 400-foot cliff face, nearly vertical, topped by fortified Japanese positions that commanded the entire approach. Tactical maps showed no easy path to the top. The only way up was by cargo net and rope ladder, climbing while exposed to enemy fire from above. Once you reached the top, you faced bunkers, spider holes, and interconnected tunnel systems that allowed Japanese soldiers to appear and disappear like ghosts. The first American attempts to take Hacksaw Ridge failed with heavy casualties. Companies climbed the cliff, established a foothold at the top, then got pushed back by Japanese counterattacks. The pattern repeated day after day. Climb, fight, retreat, count the dead. Desmond Doss climbed that cliff with his unit every single time. And every single time, his fellow soldiers saw what a combat medic without a weapon could do. During the early assaults on Hacksaw Ridge, something changed in Company B. The men who had called Desmond a coward watched him run into enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers. They watched him treat injuries under direct machine gun fire, never flinching, completely focused on saving lives. On May 2nd, during a failed assault, Desmond treated 4 men who were hit by the same machine gun burst. He crawled to each one, applied tourniquets, administered morphine, and dragged them to cover. Japanese bullets kicked up dirt around him the entire time. When he finally made it back to safety, his uniform was shredded, but he wasn't hit. The soldiers who had thrown boots at him during basic training started calling him Doc. They stopped questioning whether he belonged in combat. They started trusting him with their lives. Captain Glover, who had tried to have him discharged, later said, "I never saw a medic work so hard or care so much. He treated every wounded man like his own brother." But the worst was still coming. May 5th, 1945, 05:30 hours. Company B prepared for another assault on Hacksaw Ridge. Intelligence reported that Japanese forces had reinforced the position overnight. Artillery pounded the top of the ridge for 30 minutes, trying to soften the defenses. At 0600 hours, the bombardment stopped. The climb began. Company B went up the cargo nets and rope ladders, rifles slung across their backs, climbing hand over hand. Japanese mortars started falling before the first men reached the top. Shrapnel tore through the climbers. Some fell, the rest kept climbing. Desmond climbed with them, his medic bag weighing 30 pounds, no weapon to defend himself. The top of Hacksaw Ridge was a nightmare. The ground was torn and cratered from weeks of artillery. Burnt tree stumps jutted from the earth like broken teeth. Japanese positions were invisible until they opened fire. A spider hole would suddenly erupt with gunfire, then go silent again. Company B pushed forward, trying to establish a defensive perimeter. They made it about 50 yards before the Japanese counterattack hit. It came from 3 directions simultaneously. Japanese soldiers emerged from hidden bunkers and tunnel exits. Machine gun fire swept across the American position. Mortar dropped with deadly accuracy. Within minutes, dozens of men were down. The order came to retreat. The Americans fell back to the cliff edge, climbing down the cargo nets as fast as they could. Japanese soldiers rushed forward, throwing grenades down after them, shooting at the climbers. Desmond Doss didn't retreat. He later said, "I could hear men crying for help. I couldn't leave them." When the last American soldier climbed down the cliff, Desmond was alone at the top with dozens of wounded men and thousands of Japanese soldiers. He started with the closest casualty, a private from Iowa who had taken shrapnel in both legs. Desmond dragged him to the cliff edge, fashioned a rope sling round his chest, and lowered him down to safety. The rope was 75 feet long. Hand over hand, Desmond controlled the descent until friendly hands grabbed the wounded man at the bottom. Then Desmond pulled the rope back up and went looking for another casualty. Japanese soldiers were everywhere. Desmond moved between shell craters and fallen trees, staying low, using the torn landscape for cover. When he found a wounded man, he did whatever was necessary, applied tourniquets, gave morphine, stopped bleeding, then dragged or carried him back to the cliff edge. Lower him down, pull the rope up, find another. The Japanese fired at him repeatedly. According to his own account and eyewitness testimony from soldiers at the base of the cliff, bullets kicked up dirt around Desmond dozens of times. Grenades exploded near him. He kept working. One wounded soldier later reported, "I saw Doss, maybe 30 yards away. He was kneeling next to someone, working on them. Machine gun fire was coming from a bunker to his right. The bullets were hitting so close, I thought he was dead. Then he just stood up, threw the guy over his shoulder, and walked away like nothing happened." Medical records document that Desmond treated and evacuated 75 men that day. 75 separate trips to the cliff edge. 75 times lowering a wounded soldier to safety. 75 times pulling that rope back up and returning to hell. He worked for 5 hours. Later, people would ask Desmond how he survived, how he went 5 hours under enemy fire without being hit, how he managed to lower 75 men when he weighed 120 pounds, and some of the wounded soldiers weighed twice that. His answer was always the same: "I prayed. Every time I found someone, I prayed. Lord, please help me get one more. Just one more." That prayer became famous. One more, the simple request that kept him moving when his body should have collapsed, when fear should have paralyzed him, when common sense said to save himself. But the prayer reveals something deeper about Desmond Doss. He didn't see 75 men. He saw one man, then another one, then another. Each individual life was precious, each one worth risking everything to save. By 1100 hours, American forces regrouped and climbed back up Hacksaw Ridge. When they reached the top, they found Desmond still treating wounded. He had established a triage area in a shell crater, organizing casualties by severity of wounds, making sure the worst cases got evacuated first. Company B secured the position. The Japanese defenders had withdrawn 2 secondary positions deeper in their tunnel network. For the moment, Hacksaw Ridge belonged to the Americans. Desmond collapsed. His hands were raw and bleeding from handling the rope. His uniform was soaked with other men's blood. He had gone 5 hours without water in 90-degree heat. Medical officers examined him and found he was severely dehydrated. His hands were torn open, and he had mild shrapnel wounds he hadn't even noticed. They evacuated him for treatment. But his war wasn't over. Desmond spent 2 days in a field hospital. On May 8th, against medical advice, he returned to Company B. The battle for Okinawa was still raging, and they needed medics. Over the next 3 weeks, Desmond continued performing the same kind of heroism that had defined his actions on May 5th. He treated wounded under fire. He crawled into no man's land to retrieve casualties. He repeatedly refused to carry a weapon, relying on faith and luck to survive. On May 21st, his luck ran out. Company B was assaulting a Japanese position when a grenade landed near Desmond. He was treating a wounded soldier at the time. The grenade exploded, driving shrapnel into both of Desmond's legs and lower body. Despite his wounds, he finished treating the other soldier, applied tourniquets to his own legs, and crawled toward friendly lines. A Japanese sniper shot him in the arm, shattering his left radius bone. Desmond used a rifle stock as a splint, the closest he ever came to touching a weapon in combat. Other soldiers reached him and started carrying him to an aid station on a stretcher. During the evacuation, enemy fire intensified. When Desmond saw another soldier get hit, he rolled off the stretcher and insisted they take the more seriously wounded man first. He waited 5 more hours before receiving treatment. By then, infection had set in. Doctors at a field hospital stabilized him, but his wounds were too severe for immediate evacuation. He spent 3 weeks in various hospitals on Okinawa, fighting infection, undergoing multiple surgeries. The Battle of Okinawa officially ended on June 22, 1945. Japanese forces suffered catastrophic losses, over 100,000 soldiers killed. American casualties exceeded 50,000, including more than 12,000 dead. It was the bloodiest battle in the Pacific Theater. Desmond Doss was evacuated to the United States in July 1945. He would never fully recover from his wounds. October 12, 1945, the White House. President Harry Truman stood in the Rose Garden to present 15 medals of honor to soldiers who had distinguished themselves in the Pacific War. Desmond Doss was among them, the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor. President Truman draped the medal around Desmond's neck and said, "I'm proud of you. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." The Medal of Honor citation documents Desmond's actions on May 5th in precise detail. It describes how he remained on Hacksaw Ridge for 5 hours, treating and evacuating 75 wounded soldiers. It notes that he did this without carrying a weapon, relying on courage and faith alone. But the citation doesn't capture the full scope of what Desmond did during the war. Between April and May 1945, he saved well over 100 lives, the 75 at Hacksaw Ridge, plus dozens more during other engagements on Okinawa. Captain Jack Glover, who had tried to have Desmond discharged during basic training, was at the Medal of Honor ceremony. Years later, he said, "I was wrong about Doss. He was the bravest man I ever commanded. He showed us what real courage looks like." The soldiers of Company B, who had called him a coward and thrown boots at him, collected money to buy Desmond a Cadillac when he returned home. They wrote letters describing his heroism. They told their families and friends about the medic who saved their lives without ever firing a shot. The heroism came with a price. Desmond's wounds at Hacksaw Ridge left him partially disabled for the rest of his life. Shrapnel remained embedded in his body. Doctors couldn't remove all of it without causing more damage. His left arm never fully healed. He walked with a limp. But the worst injury was one no one saw. Desmond contracted tuberculosis while hospitalized for his combat wounds. The tuberculosis destroyed one of his lungs. In 1946, doctors removed 5 ribs and his left lung in an attempt to stop the disease's spread. The treatment required heavy use of antibiotics, which destroyed Desmond's hearing. By the 1950s, he was nearly deaf. He required a hearing aid for the rest of his life. Despite these challenges, Desmond never expressed regret about his service. He married Dorothy Scott, his longtime girlfriend, in 1942, before deploying. They remained married until her death in 1991. He spent decades speaking to church groups, schools, and military organizations about his experiences, always emphasizing that faith and courage were not contradictory. They reinforced each other. Desmond Doss died on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87. He is buried in Chattanooga National Cemetery with full military honors. His gravestone includes his Medal of Honor citation. To understand what Desmond accomplished, you need to understand what combat medics actually did in World War II. This wasn't modern battlefield medicine with helicopters and advanced trauma care. This was primitive, brutal, and often fatal. A combat medic in 1945 carried a medical bag weighing approximately 30 pounds. The bag contained morphine syrettes for pain management, sulfanilamide powder to prevent infection, bandages and gauze, plasma for blood loss, tourniquets, scissors, and surgical tools, iodine for wound cleaning. That was it. No antibiotics beyond sulfur drugs. No way to treat internal injuries. No advanced life support. A medic's job was to stabilize casualties long enough to evacuate them to a field hospital where real surgeons could work. The mortality rate for combat injuries reflected these limitations. If you were hit in the torso or head, your survival depended entirely on how fast you reached a surgeon. If you suffered arterial bleeding, you had minutes before death. If you developed infection, which was common, you might die days later, despite surviving the initial injury. Combat medics worked under conditions that would horrify modern medical professionals. They performed triage in shell craters while under fire. They amputated limbs with pocket knives. They made life or death decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help. The casualty rate among medics was extremely high. They wore Red Cross armbands that were supposed to identify them as non-combatants under the Geneva Convention. Japanese forces in the Pacific routinely ignored this protection, deliberately targeting medics because killing them demoralized entire units. Desmond Doss went into this environment without even the minimal protection of a weapon. For decades after the war, military historians and ethicists debated Desmond's choice not to carry a weapon. Some argued he endangered others by being unable to defend his position. Others pointed out that his dedication to medicine probably saved more lives than he could have taken with a rifle. The soldiers of Company B settled this debate definitively. In interviews conducted decades after the war, every surviving member who served with Desmond said the same thing. They felt safer with him around because they knew if they got hit, Doc Doss would come for them no matter what. That psychological impact mattered. Studies of combat effectiveness consistently show that morale and unit cohesion affect survival rates more than firepower. Soldiers who trust their medic fight more aggressively because they know someone will save them if they fall. Desmond's faith made him fearless in ways that armed soldiers couldn't match. Men with rifles took cover and returned fire, normal, rational behavior. Desmond ran toward casualties in the open because he believed God would protect him. That irrational courage inspired everyone around him. There's also a practical consideration. Desmond worked as a medic, not a rifleman. Every moment he spent treating casualties was a moment he wasn't shooting. If he had carried a weapon, there might have been times when he chose to fight instead of heal. His absolute commitment to medicine meant he never faced that choice. Modern historians have extensively researched the events at Hacksaw Ridge to verify Desmond's account. The conclusion: everything he claimed happened. The 77th Infantry Division's after-action reports for May 5, 1945, document the failed assault and chaotic retreat. They confirm that numerous wounded were left behind when the unit withdrew. They document that one medic remained at the top of the ridge and evacuated casualties despite enemy fire. Eyewitness accounts from soldiers at the base of the cliff describe watching Desmond lower wounded men one after another for hours. Multiple witnesses independently reported seeing him under fire, seeing near misses, watching him work with what appeared to be supernatural protection. The number 75 men comes from two sources. First, Desmond himself counted each evacuation. Second, the division maintained casualty logs that tracked every wounded soldier evacuated from specific positions. The May 5th logs from Hacksaw Ridge show 75 casualties evacuated via rope from the cliff top, all credited to one medic's actions. Some historians initially questioned whether one man could physically accomplish this. The mathematics are daunting. 75 men, average weight 160 pounds, lowered by hand 75 feet. That's over 500,000 foot-pounds of work, done by a man who weighed 120 pounds, over 5 hours. But the rope system made it possible. Desmond used the cliff edge as a pulley point, and gravity did most of the work, lowering casualties down. His job was controlling the descent, not bearing the full weight. It was exhausting and dangerous, but physically possible. The real question isn't whether he did it. The real question is why. Why did Desmond risk certain death to save soldiers who had mocked and rejected him? Desmond Doss was a Seventh-day Adventist his entire life. His faith wasn't complicated or philosophical. It was straightforward and absolute. The 10 Commandments said, "Thou shalt not kill," so he wouldn't kill. The Commandments said to keep the Sabbath holy, so he refused to work on Saturdays. The teachings said to love your neighbor, so he loved the soldiers around him, even when they hated him. This simplicity confused people. Military leaders expected him to make exceptions, to compromise when circumstances demanded it. His fellow soldiers expected him to get angry when they abused him, to seek revenge, to break eventually. He never did. After the war, reporters asked Desmond if he ever felt afraid on Hacksaw Ridge. He said yes, he was terrified the entire time. They asked if he ever wanted to give up. He said yes, every time he pulled that rope back up and saw more wounded men, he wanted to collapse. But he also said something else. When you have faith, really have it, fear doesn't make you run away. Fear makes you trust God more. That statement captures the paradox of Desmond Doss. He wasn't brave because he felt no fear. He was brave despite being afraid, because his faith gave him something stronger than fear to hold on to. Modern military psychologists study combat stress and what makes soldiers capable of extraordinary heroism. The research consistently shows that soldiers who perform above and beyond share certain traits. They have strong moral frameworks. They feel deep connection to their units. And they possess what researchers call purpose-driven courage, the ability to act because of what they believe, not despite what they fear. Desmond Doss embodied all three traits. His Seventh-day Adventist faith gave him an unshakable moral framework. His commitment to medicine connected him to every soldier in his unit, and his purpose saving lives drove every action he took. Desmond Doss's story remained relatively unknown for decades after World War II. He lived quietly in Georgia, working various jobs despite his disabilities. He spoke occasionally at churches and schools, but never sought publicity. In 2004, a documentary titled The Conscientious Objector brought his story to wider attention. The film included interviews with Desmond, now elderly but still sharp, describing his experiences in his own words. Veterans of Company B appeared on camera, some of them crying as they remembered how Doc Doss saved their lives. The documentary won awards and generated renewed interest in Desmond's story. Hollywood came calling. In 2016, director Mel Gibson released Hacksaw Ridge, a feature film starring Andrew Garfield as Desmond Doss. The film was nominated for 6 Academy Awards and won 2, but Desmond never saw the movie. He died 10 years before its release. The men who served with him, the ones still alive, attended the premiere. They said the film captured the essential truth. Desmond Doss was the real thing. A genuine hero who lived his faith without compromise and saved lives because he believed every person mattered. The U.S. Army now includes Desmond's story in combat medic training. Instructors use his example to teach that heroism comes in many forms, that courage isn't just about fighting, and that the medics who save lives under fire deserve the same respect as soldiers who take lives in battle. There's a statue of Desmond at the National Museum of the United States Army. It shows him in combat gear, mimic bag in hand, no weapon visible. The inscription reads, Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. So what happened when a combat medic refused to carry a weapon at Hacksaw Ridge? He became one of the most decorated soldiers in American history. He saved 75 men in a single day, over 100 during the Battle of Okinawa, and countless more throughout his service. He received the Medal of Honor from the President of the United States. He proved that courage and faith are not opposites, they're partners. But more than that, he changed how America thinks about conscientious objectors and combat service. Before Desmond Doss, conscientious objector meant someone who refused to serve. After Desmond Doss, it meant someone whose service took a different form, but was no less valuable. The soldiers who mocked him in basic training learned that carrying a weapon doesn't make you brave. Running into gunfire to save lives makes you brave. Following your conscience when everyone says you're wrong makes you brave. Climbing back up that cliff, over and over, when you could have stayed safe below. That's the definition of courage. Desmond Doss went to war without a weapon and came home a hero. He proved that you don't have to kill to serve. You don't have to compromise your beliefs to make a difference. And you don't have to be like everyone else to be invaluable. That's what happened at Hacksaw Ridge.